Art must be literal!
Art can be anything it wants to be!
America's booming economy meant it could afford to further explore cultural pastimes, and art became more accessible for the public, both to create and appreciate. This led to many new opinions, movements, and styles in art. As time progressed, traditional paintings, grounded in realism, clashed with newer movements of Cubism and Futurism, as artists started to paint what they felt rather than what they saw.
Society transformed through the Industrial Revolution, so did the art. As urbanization increased, the traditional art styles of the previous centuries, particularly of the Romantic era that exhibited grandeur and idealized life, began to face competition with the growing popularity of realism. The realism movement began in the 1850s and retained a strong presence in the art world throughout the next century. Realism wanted to emphasize real life as much as possible. It focused on contemporary subject matters, often taking place in rural and urban settings with ordinary working-class citizens and activities. These artworks were extremely detailed in their focus of light and shadows, perspective, and depth in order to be as straightforward as possible, which usually limited the interpretation of these pieces. Many realism artists intentionally demonstrated grittier, raw aspects of city living to make it feel as authentic as possible. As the new century progressed, many people were unsure of how to handle the rapid changes and further sought out the certainty they found in these realistic, truthful artworks. But soon, even realism began to change, and modern realism clashed slightly with traditional realism. The Ashcan School of Art took new looks at realism and explored new styles. It left more space for interpretation, such as the paintings like Edward Hopper's House by the Railroad from 1925. It showcased figures and buildings in isolation, representing the isolation that had been caused by modern life. These new views on realism somewhat went against the traditional realism and acted as a stepping stone into newer art movements.
Meanwhile, in Europe, Martinetti was starting the Italian Futurism movement. This movement was very popular among the Italian Fascist Party, but eventually it spread around the world to other fascists, but also non-fascists, and ended up in the States. After the First World War, some artists wanted something different. They wanted to paint dynamics and motion rather than just stills. They did this through blurring repetition and force lines, such as in Dynamic Velocity of Interborough Rapid Transit Power Station by the American futurist Francis and Stevens. The artist Joseph Sella was almost solely responsible for spreading this movement to the United States. He was born and raised in Italy, but moved to New York City bringing his futurist art with him. He participated in many galleries and spread the interest in Futurism around. One painting of his that was a large part of this influence is called Coney Island.
During the early 1900s, many artists began to reject the view that artwork could only be viewed from one point. This movement was known as Cubism, which was a part of the avant-garde movement. Many French-inspired American artists set out to break the planes of past perception and geometry itself. The works of Pablo Picasso, Georges Braque, and many others spread to the United States. Once Americans had caught wind of the new idea, they wanted in for themselves. The two main phases embodying Cubism, the analytical and synthetic, embraced brighter colors, a 3D point of view, and generally perceiving with the mind, not just the eyes. During the 1920s, many Americans felt unsettled. Some wanted to stick to traditional values, and others wanted to break beyond them. However, this new and embracive point of view was not shared by both the traditionalists and the modernists. This was best represented in Elsie Driggs' Pittsburgh. This portrait is one of a factory and its pipes that begin to melt and twist into a sort of grotesque form as the theme progresses. Traditionalists, however, wanted to view this painting as a representation of the environment and America's booming capitalism, and nothing else. However, modernists wanted to view this painting as a satire and a comedic take on how new technological advancements were twisting society into darkness, and even mocked capitalism, which was a major part of the 1920s. This particular work of art challenged the viewer to embrace an abstract topic in order to extract the real meaning, without external cues. Stuart Davis was also a successful cubist. His portrait, Chinatown, alluded to the social reality of his working class for immigrants. The poor woman in the picture lives within the slums of the city, and his subtle cues, such as the signs on the window as well as the Ashcan School, which was a representation of the poorer lives within America during the 1920s, was brutally honest. Many traditionalists viewed the painting as one set within a fantasy and agreed that immigrants should live in poorer conditions. However, many modernists felt that this portrait really sympathized with the immigrants and felt that they should be welcomed within the nation. This portrait, however, was an earlier form of Cubism, which is why there isn't as many aspects of 3D, and bright colors. Georgia O'Keeffe was another successful American cubist and much more famous. This portrait, like George's reflection, used abstract techniques and mirrored the perception that reflections were based on individual beliefs. This incorporates both the point of view of the lake as well as its reflection. This work of art puzzled many within its time frame during the 1920s as they struggled to extract the meaning within the bright colors, 3D aspects, and mainly its simplicity. These paintings were some of the new ideas that surprised many Americans. Similarly, this portrait, Still Life, by Patrick Henry Bruce, emphasized the different points of view and 3D aspect of newer paintings, flat, bright colors, and different geometric planes. The Cubism movement was one of great importance to future American generations, and it also represented the conflict between traditionalism and modernity. Many viewers struggled to appreciate simplicity, bold colors, and different perceptions on many works of art. Progressing through the 1920s, Cubism provided many artists with an outlook to express within the abstract, the simple, and the unknown.
As all these new and old paintings coexisted at first, they all came to clash at the New York Armory Show. Since these new styles mostly originated in Europe, they were brought to America for the first time in this Armory Show of 1913. As the exhibition went on, things got more and more intense. Art was heavily criticized, as Duchamp's nude descending down a staircase was described as an explosion in a shingle factory. As the show moved on to other American cities, such as Chicago, modern paintings were even sometimes burned by traditionalists.
Both Futurism and Cubism were totally different from all other types of art and ideas of the time. They deviated from the normal realistic ideals and styles and went with more abstract and dynamic pieces. This is important because as the United States was going through a progressive reformation in many other areas, the artistic movement had to follow because they wanted change and reformation as well.